This episode is brought to you by Curiosity Streamers, a subscription streaming service that offers thousands of documentaries and non-fiction titles. Right now, you guys can get 25% off the cost of a subscription. More on them in just a bit. The saying goes, some are born to greatness while others have greatness thrust upon them. It's a pithy phrase, one which seems to capture some vague truth about the world, but it also fails to encapsulate today's subject. To have greatness thrust upon them is too passive, implying you're either great from birth or become so due to the actions of others. But there was nothing passive about Father Miguel Hidalgo's moment in history. After decades as an anonymous nobody, he didn't so much have greatness thrust upon him as he did grab it by the balls and make it squeal for mercy. A scandalous priest in Mexico's Bajío region, Hidalgo jumped headlong into history with his 1810 cry of Dolores, a paean for equality that echoed far beyond his parish. Coming at a time of chronic instability, it inspired the uprising that became the Mexican War of Independence. But how did this happen? How did the actions of one small-town priest wind up changing North American history? Well, the answer lies in a tale of chaos, revolution, and heartbreaking tragedy. If your mental image of a Mexican revolutionary is of a glorious mustachioed peasant warrior, then the early life of Miguel Hidalgo might surprise you. Born on May 8, 1753, in a hacienda near the silver mining city of Guanajuato, Hidalgo didn't grow up in a cruel, hardscrabble world, but one of comparative luxury. His family, were Criollos, people of pure European descent, born in the Spanish colony of New Spain. Numbering about 1 million, they were the comfortable middle class of the viceroyalty, the wealthy types who filled the priesthood and junior officer ranks. Below them groaned two vast lower classes, the part European, part indigenous mestizos, and the pure-blood Indians, the impoverished majority of the population. In the socially stratified colony, these were the ones who scraped by so Criollos could live their easy lives. But while the Criollos were near the top of this miserable period, they weren't at the pinnacle. That place was reserved for the Europeans who'd been born in Spain itself, the Peninsulares. If the Criollos were the priests and junior officers, the Peninsulares were the generals and archbishops, the elite of the elite. Numbering a mere 15,000 in a colony of 6 million, they wielded their privilege like a jewel-encrusted club, insisting the tropical climate made the Criollos mentally inferior to those born in Europe. This meant a ban on Criollo officers advancing past captain, on Criollo priests becoming bishops, on families progressing no matter how much money or prestige they had. It was a crazy, divisive policy, one which helped foster resentment among even the most powerful Criollos. And Miguel Hidalgo's family were less powerful than most. Despite being of European descent, Hidalgo's father was relatively poor. He didn't own a hacienda, but managed one, keeping in close contact with the Indians doing all of the real work. That meant Hidalgo grew up with an insight into the lives of the lower classes that his contemporaries lacked, even learning 3 native languages. Still, the boy had more opportunities than most New Spain residents. Opportunities like studying in Valladolid, today Merida, Mexico, for his degree in philosophy and theology. From there, it was an easy stroll across the cosseted halls of affluence into the priesthood. But while he may have been ordained, Father Hidalgo was never very priestly. During his time teaching at Colegio de San Nicolas, Hidalgo treated his ecclesiastical job as less a calling and more of a game of see how much I can get away with before the boss fires my ass. A lifelong gambler, Hidalgo's idea of a good time was going partying, winning big, then hooking up with one of his mistresses to jointly piss on his vow of celibacy. Over his lifetime, he'd live in sin with multiple women, sire multiple children, and generally have the sort of fun times the church typically frowns on. But we'd be doing the padre a disservice if we painted him as merely a louche fornicator, because Hidalgo was an incisive free thinker. As a priest, Hidalgo was one of the few people in New Spain allowed to read heretical books on the assumption that he'd then write clever tracts refuting them. Instead, he seems to have enjoyed swimming in blasphemous thought, devouring the works of great Enlightenment thinkers, absorbing ideas of natural law and social justice. In this, he was ironically encouraged by the prelate, Manuel Abad y Queipo, a Peninsulare who felt sorry for New Spain's impoverished millions. No doubt Queipo envisioned Hidalgo becoming like him, a loyal colonial foot soldier who nonetheless tinkered with social problems, trying to alleviate misery. This is probably why Queipo helped the younger man get quietly transferred after he got in trouble with debt, rather than defrocking him. But it wouldn't be as a good colonial tinkering with New Spain's social system that Hidalgo found his fame. Oh no, instead, he'd soon blow the whole rotten edifice sky high. For a decade after leaving Colegio de San Nicolas, Hidalgo bounced around working in various villages, even surviving a brush with the one thing nobody expects, the Spanish Inquisition. It was only in 1803 that he wound up in the town that today bears his name, Dolores Hidalgo. Of course, it was just plain old Dolores when the priest first rolled up, a typical barrio town with typical barrio problems. And in this era, there were plenty of them. Famous for its silver, the barrio had been plunged into a prolonged depression by a global price crash. So bad was the sump that it wasn't just the Indian mine workers who were suffering, but also the mestizos and even the criollos. For Don Hidalgo, this was the exact sort of social challenge that he was born to deal with. As the town's new priest, he subcontracted his ecclesiastical duties to an assistant and instead focused on a grand plan to restart the economy. Hidalgo's brainwave was to get the locals working on more varied, self-sustaining cottage industries, rather than just relying on the mines. He bought silkworms so the impoverished Indians could learn to rear them, set up a series of terraces for growing grapes to make wine. It was an attempt to help Dolores stand on its own feet, to break the cycles of poverty Hidalgo saw across the barrio. But it was also an opportunity to start putting Enlightenment ideas into practice. By now, the priest had grown into a thin 50-something man with a shiny bald head and eyes that were alive with both intelligence and occasional flashes of white-hot anger. Anger because, as he kept reading subversive literature, Hidalgo was drifting more and more towards politics, to radical solutions to the issues surrounding him. Nor was he the only one. Amid its ongoing slump, the entire barrio was alive with literary societies, where criollos met less to discuss literature and more to spend hours ranting about the useless colonial government. Yet it would be events taking place over 9,000 kilometers away that would turn these literary societies into the touch paper for the mother of all explosions. While New Spain had been dealing with its own internal tensions, the mothership in Madrid had been dealing with a far greater external threat: the Napoleonic Wars. In March 1808, French troops crossed the border, forcing Charles IV to abdicate in favour of his son, Ferdinand VII. But then Napoleon decided this wasn't enough, and got really crazy. The abdications of Bayonne saw Ferdinand imprisoned and forced to abdicate in favour of Napoleon's brother, Joseph Bonaparte. The problem was Spain's entire empire rested on a legitimacy drawn from the Spanish throne. Place a usurper on the throne and, well, you could probably see how things might go wrong from there. In the American colonies of New Granada and Rio de la Plata, the Bonapartist coup did to society what nitroglycerin does when dropped into a gathering of clowns. There was pandemonium. Juntas claiming to represent the deposed Ferdinand sprang up, ready to fight those loyal to the Bonapartist regime. In New Spain, the Criollos tried to do likewise. But sensing the whole Viva Ferdinand thing might be code for let's replace the Peninsulares, the Peninsulares overthrew the sympathetic viceroy and cracked down hard on any sign of dissent. This way, they managed to keep a lid on the sort of revolt springing up in South America. Even as the Peninsular War erupted back home, damaging Madrid's ability to administer an empire, New Spain remained grudgingly stable. But the Peninsulares could only delay the inevitable. Up in the Bajío, the Criollo literary groups Hidalgo belonged to were starting to look at this cruddy setup and wonder if they couldn't do better ruling themselves. By the time 1810 rolled around, they'd gone from simply wondering it to outright planning the unthinkable. Alright, we'll get back to today's video in just a minute, but first, a word from today's sponsor, CuriosityStream. CuriosityStream is a subscription streaming service that offers thousands of documentaries and non-fiction titles from some of the world's best filmmakers, including exclusive originals. Think of it as the Netflix for nerds, the Hulu for history buffs. CuriosityStream is available on many platforms and web apps, including Roku, Android, Xbox One, smart TVs, iOS, Chromecast, Amazon Fire, Apple and Apple TV. It's a lot of places. It's also offered worldwide, and it's constantly updated with amazing timely content. For example, this spring, they added an 8-part series called The Bone Detectives. Now, if you like biographies, and we're gonna think you do, maybe head over to CuriosityStream and check out their bio-documentaries on Alexander the Great, William the Conqueror, and so many more famous names. You can also check out American Icons, a 9-part series that tells the story of Babe Ruth, Eleanor Roosevelt, Mark Twain, and more. CuriosityStream.com is where you go for unlimited access to the world's top documentaries and non-fiction series. And right now, you guys can use the code Biographics to save 25% off the cost of an annual subscription, which comes out to just $14.99 a year, not a month, per year. It's a great deal. Click the link below or just go to curiositystream.com/biographics and you'll save 25%, making it just $14.99 for the whole year. And now back to today's video. In the annals of spectacular bad timing, it's hard to beat Francisco Xavier Venegas. Sent from Spain to make sure Madrid retained control of its colonies during Napoleonic upheavals, Venegas arrived in Mexico City on September 14, 1810. And if you know anything about Mexican history, you know that this was mere hours before everything exploded. Ever since the Peninsulares coup of 1808, the plot in the Bayou had been solidifying. In Dolores, Father Hidalgo had opened a new cottage industry for peasants, secretly manufacturing weapons. Meanwhile, the Queretare Literary Club at the heart of it all had added important members, guys like Criollo Captain Ignacio de Allende or the wealthy Juan de Aldama. By the fall of 1810, their plans were nearly ready. In just a few short weeks, they'd be ready to overthrow the Peninsulares and install a pro-Carrillo government. Only a few short weeks would turn out to be far longer than they actually had. That September, officials contacted the mayor of Queretaro, informing him of the revolutionary plot in his city. Stupidly, they didn't realize the mayor's wife was in on it. When she heard the news, she immediately sounded the alarm. September 15th saw Ignacio de Allende and Juan de Aldama ride like hell from Allende's hometown of San Miguel to Dolores. Arriving after midnight, they woke Father Hidalgo in his bed to tell him the game was up. It's at this point that Hidalgo finally reached out to grab greatness by the nutsack. Rather than flee into hiding, the priest ordered the church bells rung, summoning his congregation. Under dark skies illuminated only by the light of flickering torches, he then gave the single most famous speech in Mexican history, Grito de Dolores, the Cry of Dolores. A passionate howl for the end of bad government, the land rights of the peasants, and the overthrow of the Peninsulares, the Cry of Dolores was simply the most electrifying thing the people had ever heard. At Hidalgo's words, the local Criollos, mestizos, and Indians were whipped into a near-religious fervor. It was a seriously powerful speech. The only problem is that today we have no idea what was said. The speech was spontaneous, no one was taking notes, and so the text was lost. Luckily enough, people later wrote down the basic gist that we know for certain what wasn't said. Anything about independence. While this is the moment that kicks off the Mexican War of Independence, a break from Spain is not what Hidalgo is calling for. Rather, he couched the uprising as a fight for the imprisoned King Ferdinand VII to forge the sort of new Spain he would undoubtedly be proud of. It was a convenient fiction, a way for Hidalgo to say, I'm not a traitor, I'm fighting for our rightful king, while also not having to actually consult that king on anything. Regardless, it still worked. As dawn broke over Dolores on September the 16th, it was on terrified Peninsulares being dragged from their beds and taken hostage, on Captain Allende gathering soldiers, on rioting peasants destroying European-owned shops. By the time the sun was up, Hidalgo and Allende were at the head of a newly formed volunteer army of around 800 men. With nothing left to lose, they marched out in the direction of San Miguel. As they went, their numbers swelled. For peasants in the villages, the news of a revolution against their hated overlords was like an invitation to come party. They flocked to Hidalgo's banner until the ranks had swollen to 4,000. It was this mob that reached San Miguel that evening. Riding ahead, Allende instructed his old comrades guarding the town not to fight, then went to parley with the terrified Peninsulares. In exchange for surrender, he told them, the mob would respect both their lives and their property. But it turns out that impassioned mobs aren't exactly great at keeping their promises. As soon as San Miguel was opened, the impoverished army went on the rampage, breaking into Peninsulare homes, looting their businesses, and destroying anything they couldn't take. In the aftermath, Allende freaked out, telling Hidalgo he needed to control the mob, but Hidalgo waved him off, saying the promise of more loot would attract more soldiers. And really, there was little they could do to stop it. The Cry of Dolores had unleashed something, a restless anger that had been stirring even before the downturn, an anger born of discrimination, lost opportunities, and spending your life stuck at the bottom of a dumb racial hierarchy. Whether Allende liked it or not, the mob was now on the warpath. He and Hidalgo could try to fight it, or they could ride its anger into legend. The speed with which Hidalgo's army swept New Spain that autumn was nothing short of astonishing, and it really was Hidalgo's army now. After San Miguel, they'd marched on Celaya, which the priest had managed to take without bloodshed simply by threatening to execute the 78 Peninsulares that they were holding hostage. In the aftermath, the ambitious Allende agreed to defer to the older man's command. Of course, that without bloodshed bit only applied to the act of taking the city. Once the gates opened, there had been more looting, rioting, and burning of rich folks' homes. So horrifying was all this pillaging that nearby settlements went on high alert, trying to arm themselves against the oncoming storm. But it's worth remembering that the destruction was only horrifying for elites. In Guanajuato, the town's mezquitos and Indians were so enthused to hear about all these Europeans dying that Governor Iano abandoned his original defense plans, instead hiding all 400 local Peninsulares in the city's imposing Alhóndiga de Granaditas. Not that it helps very much. Hidalgo arrived at the town on September the 26th at the head of 20,000 men, having taken many smaller towns en route. On their arrival, 10,000 locals immediately defected to their cause. When the combined army attacked the Alhóndiga, the outcome was inevitable. The fierce, bloody battle saw Governor Iano shot through his head, the Alhóndiga set alight, and those inside massacred. All told, some 2,000 died in the fighting, and this was only the beginning. With the Alhóndiga still smoking, Governor Iano's body was stripped naked and hoisted up a flagpole while the mob attacked the city, burning, looting, and killing their way across town. This time, Hidalgo tried to stop them. After 2 days of uproar somewhere between Carnival and the sack of Troy, the priest commanded his men to stop the violence. In response, they kept right on rioting. And here we get to the eternal issue with Hidalgo's army. While they were an army in the sense that they followed their leader into battle, they were also at heart an unruly drunken mob out to smash stuff. Being able to direct where they smashed stuff gave Hidalgo real power, but it also left him vulnerable to the mob's vagaries. The rioting in Guanajuato, that drove a not insignificant number of Criollos to side with the Peninsulares. Criollos who would have signed on for a disciplined revolution, but were now terrified of starring in a Spanish sequel to the Reign of Terror. But Don Hidalgo had gone too far to back out now. He might be getting nervous about the violence displayed by his followers, but he also knew that this was his best chance to change New Spain for the better, and by this point the Padre had some serious changes in mind. Privately, he was admitting that he was no longer interested in fighting for Ferdinand VII, that an independent New Spain might be the way forward. Publicly, he was embracing the radical demands of his peasant army, the restitution of lands to indigenous peoples, the outlawing of slavery, and, perhaps unsurprisingly, the reduction of alcohol taxes. He even designed a new banner for his men to march under, one showing the Virgin of Guadalupe, a darker-skinned Mary worshipped by New Spain's non-Europeans. There was always an army that seemed to speak for the colony's dispossessed far more than it spoke for the Criollos. And while this would soon cause problems, for now it gave Hidalgo the raw manpower that he needed. On October the 17th, the army took Valladolid without a fight, returning Hidalgo to his old home for the first time in decades. With the city pacified, the priest went to the cathedral recently vacated by his former mentor, Manuel Abad y Queipo, who'd fled after declaring Hidalgo excommunicated, and held a mass of thanksgiving. 3 days later, his now 80,000-strong army marched out again, this time in the direction of the biggest prize of all, Mexico City. I remember Francisco Xavier Venegas, the guy who arrived in Mexico City just in time to have the worst first week of work ever. Well, he was watching Hidalgo's army approach with what we can only assume was mounting dread. As the last days of safety slipped by, he fortified the city and debated whether to flee to Veracruz. However, he also did one very clever thing. With one of the only printing presses in New Spain under his command, Venegas had reams of anti-Hidalgo propaganda printed, pamphlets playing up the atrocities in stark terms. The hope was it might turn people against the errant priest, that if Venegas and all the other Peninsulares survived, they might be able to recruit new supporters. Not that surviving seemed like something Venegas would be able to put on his next CV. On October the 30th, Hidalgo met the city's defenders at the Battle of Monte de las Cruces. While the fighting was super costly for the priest, 2,000 of his men died and another 40,000 deserted, it also ended in victory. Mexico City was now wide open, and it's here we get to one of the biggest alternate history of all. Despite Allende being all like, "Bro, what are you waiting for? Attack already!" Hidalgo hesitated. He tried to open negotiations for a surrender. When there was no response, he hesitated some more. And then, after 3 whole days camped before the trembling city, the priest did something astonishing. He ordered his men to pack up and turn around. Today, the consensus is that Miguel Hidalgo blew it by not attacking the capital. Despite depleted ranks, he could almost certainly have taken the city and possibly have declared an independent Mexico then and there. Instead, the War of Independence would now drag on for another 10 years, outlasting all of the characters that we've met today and leaving much of the country an impoverished ruin. The crazy part? No one knows for certain why Hidalgo retreated, although there are theories, the most persuasive of which involves General Felix Calleja. As Hidalgo advanced on the capital, the growing alliance of Peninsulares and Criollos that we might as well start calling royalists hadn't just been sitting around waiting to die. In San Luis Potosí, General Calleja had raised an army. The same day, Hidalgo won the Battle of Monte de las Cruces. He'd attacked Dolores, birthplace of the revolution, sacking the priest's home. Now he was making his way toward the capital, a professional soldier at the head of a small but well-disciplined army. Some think Hidalgo sounded the retreat to avoid doing battle with them, in which case, wow, that's a hell of an own goal. By sheer fluke, Hidalgo's retreat took him right into the path of Calleja's forces. The subsequent battle of Aculco saw the rebels collapse into disorderly retreat, losing nearly 100 men to Calleja's single casualty. Still, it's not like the defeat was decisive. Although they'd just been humiliated, the insurgents still seemed to be riding a wave of revolutionary feeling. Across the nation, peasant uprisings inspired by Hidalgo were capturing cities. When the priest led his demoralized army into one such city, Guadalajara, they were welcomed as heroes. Nor was Guadalajara the only place to have fallen. That November, Tepic, San Blas, and San Luis Potosí were all overwhelmed by peasant rebels. Inspired by the news, Hidalgo spent his time in the grand city establishing a proto-state, the first glimmerings of what would eventually become independent Mexico. Yet even now, danger was closing in. On November the 24th, Calleja's forces retook Guanajuato. Sent to defend it, Allende was instead forced to flee in ignominious defeat. It was a warning sign, a grim prophecy of what was to come. Miguel Hidalgo might feel like he was at the beginning of a grand fight for independence, but the truth was that his part in it was already nearly over. As 1811 approached, a feeling of paranoia seemed to settle over the not-quite-so-government in Guadalajara. Father Hidalgo became increasingly worried about assassination, imploring a follower to sip from his wine before he touched it, a prescient move since Allende was considering trying to poison him. At the same time, arguments were erupting between the two over tactics. Allende would scream that they needed to abandon Guadalajara and turn to guerrilla fighting to stand a chance of survival. But Hidalgo refused. He preferred the idea of rolling everything on a single confrontation between his army and Calleja's, confident that the rebels' manpower advantage would carry the day. It was a gambler's move, befitting the kind of wayward young man the priest had been back in Valladolid. Yet, there's just one problem with big gambles. When they go wrong, they go wrong spectacularly. On January the 16th, 1811, word arrived that Calleja was in striking distance. Some sources say Hidalgo told his men that the next day they'd eat breakfast in Guadalajara and dinner in Mexico City. Instead, the only thing Hidalgo ate was a supremely bitter serving of humble pie. Taking place at the eponymous bridge, the Battle of Calderón was, at the moment the uprising died. Defeated by the superior force, Hidalgo's men broke and fled, leaving Guadalajara open to the royalists. While Hidalgo and Allende both escaped, the captain was so enraged that he arrested the priest, taking control of the remnants of the army. Allende's plan was to quick march north, cross into the USA, and raise American mercenaries to continue the fight. But it would go no better than Hidalgo's plans for the Battle of Calderón. On March the 21st, 1811, the fleeing army entered the small settlement of Acatita de Baján, unaware that its Criollo soldiers had read Venegas' propaganda, heard of the atrocities, and concluded that they'd rather side with the royalists. Hidalgo, Allende, and Juan Aldama were all arrested, dragged to Chihuahua, and put on trial. On June the 26th, Allende and Aldama were both shot by firing squad. A month later, it was Hidalgo's turn. After being defrocked, the now ex-priest was led outside on July the 30th, 1811. While he apologized for the violence, he supposedly refused to disavow his dream of an independent Mexico. Miguel Hidalgo y Costilla was executed, aged 58, a traitor in the eyes of many of his fellow Criollos. Afterwards, his head was cut off and sent to Guanajuato, where it was hung from the Alhóndiga. For this former priest, the story was over. But not for Mexico, because the dream of independence didn't die with Don Hidalgo. For the next 10 years, the war rumbled on, before finally ending in August 1821 with a shock rebel victory. And while the kind of free Mexico that emerged would bear far more resemblance to the Criollo dreams than the radical, far more equitable society Hidalgo had planned, it would at least remain out of Madrid's clutches. As we reach the end of this video, then, it's fair to say that Miguel Hidalgo left behind a legacy that's complex. On the one hand, he was one of the most important people in Mexican history, a man without whom Mexico as we know it wouldn't even exist. On the other, he failed to see his dream through to completion. Instead, It was left to those who came after to try and build an independent state, to argue over what it should look like. And those arguments would lead to decades of instability. It's often said that some are born to greatness while others have greatness thrust upon them. But the life of Father Hidalgo shows us there exists another type of person, those with the courage to reach out and grasp greatness, even if only for a second, just long enough to change the world. Because make no mistake, without this one priest, our world today would look very different. Now, just before you leave today, maybe you're looking for something else to watch, why not check out my new channel called Biographics? Want to know all of the details about some of history's most famous battles and wars? Come join me on Biographics, from Sherman's March to the Sea to Operation Barbarossa. If it's got people fighting each other, or occasionally animals, we will cover it. There is a link below.